Okay, welcome back to the last part of Judiciary, so part 3B. So let's get right into it. Okay, so we're talking about implementation now, implementation of Supreme Court decisions. So how do they make their rulings stick? Remember, I mentioned this before. Andrew Jackson, Cherokee Nation, Justice Marshall wrote the opinion, and then Andrew Jackson said Chief Justice Marshall has made his decision. Let him enforce it. And of course, nothing happened. The Cherokee removal from Georgia in that case went on ahead because President Jackson did not implement it. So there is an issue there. There is that part of the court. So the first step is that the lawyers and judges, and this is really important, must understand the decision. And this is the point of writing those opinions. It's not just making the idea known, it's making how it's supposed to be implemented known. So lawyers and judges need to understand that and correctly reflect the intent of the Supreme Court. So that's step number one. And then step number two is the finishing of it. The people who need to implement it have to actually do it. There is room for things to fall through the cracks. Something big and major like Jackson and the Georgia Cherokee Nation issue, huge. But there are also small things that can slip through the cracks. So they actually have to do it. The other two branches, however, can do some things. Sometimes there is room for the other two branches excuse me, to restrict perhaps what the court's ruling was. And in fact, sometimes the court in their decisions might invite them to do that. Say, hey, you didn't pass this law this way, but if you do it like this, it'll be fine. So there are things like that that can happen. And also, we and the other people, judges and lawyers as well, we have to understand our new rights. The Miranda decision back in 1965 that said, that we have to be read our rights. You have the right to remain silent and all that. That has to be known. We actually have to know that for us to be able to make it happen. So that's the idea there as well. And then the government can help, national and state government can help or hurt this process. So it's not just that they do it, it actually has to be implemented. Okay, so let's talk about the court. We're going to talk a little bit of history here for a few slides. So prior to the Civil War, the agenda of the court generally was involved with supremacy issues, and we've seen a couple of those in our cases. Marbury versus Madison and McCulloch both had supremacy as part of their issues. And it also, lots of stuff had to do with slavery, as you might imagine, especially as we get closer and closer to the Civil War. From the end of the Civil War to the end of the New Deal era, we have the federal government and the economy as the major agenda of the court. There were more and more restrictions or more and more regulations being allowed in the name of interstate commerce and using that commerce power, more restrictions than not, or more regulations than not on the economy. In our modern era, so at the end of the New Deal, basically World War II to the present, we've had personal liberty and social and political equality issues, all of the stuff that happens in the Warren Court with civil rights and things like that. So we're going to have enlarged personal freedoms and civil rights, allowed more regulation of the economy, continuing to be able to use the Commerce Clause. But then in the last couple of decades, and we saw this with the Lopez case, that reversed the economic regulation somewhat. So the last couple of decades or 3 decades are where that has started to reverse itself. All right, so let's talk about judicial review really quick. Again, Chief Justice John Marshall, Marbury versus Madison is our case. We've dealt with this. Power of judicial review, I'm just going to zip through this. Acts of Congress constitutional or not. This power causes a lot of controversy, as you might imagine. For instance, we'll give you one of the big controversies. The Taney Court, the Tawney Court, declaring that Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional is an excellent example of this. Of the court saying, hey, it's our review. We rule that back there in 1820 in the Missouri Compromise that, remember they made that compromise and said that we're going to, if we're going to have one state enter, we'll have 2 states enter, one slave state and one free state. So we have, so the Senate stays balanced that way. But then they also said that Congress gets to, or some parts of the new territories couldn't have slaves, the Nebraska Territory, etc. And what the Tawney Court did was say that was unconstitutional, meaning that Congress could not forbid slavery in those states. This is all leading up to 1850, So if you were, this is American history, hopefully you remember some of that. All right, so during the New Deal, the court then begins to dismantle. Remember, much of the first New Deal that Roosevelt signed, that Congress passed, was determined to be unconstitutional. The NRA, the AAA, things like that. And Roosevelt got extremely angry with this, as he angrily referred to them, called them the 9 old men, disparaged them somewhat. And then he proposed that idea, if you remember from last year, what comes to be called court packing, and in order to put enough of his people on the Supreme Court. So remember what this is. In the last 3 weeks, the definition of this has changed, and you have got to not fall for that. Court packing is adding seats to the Supreme Court so you get enough of your people on there so your stuff is determined to be constitutional. In the last 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks, 3 weeks really, the media has decided that there's a new definition for court packing, and that is actually filling a seat that's actually open. Okay, whatever you think of the fact that Judge Barrett has been nominated for this seat, do not fall for media crap. Okay, court packing is adding seats. Filling a current seat is not court packing. Okay, it is up to you to call out the media on this kind of stuff, because they're going to try to change definitions. So please don't let them do that. So remember, this was so over the top then that Congress didn't even bring it up. They had veto-proof majorities for the Democrats in Congress. Roosevelt wanted this. Of course, he's a Democrat. And they still didn't bring it up because they looked at it and they knew that it was a bad thing. All right, so some say the Supreme Court got the message, though, because from that day forward of the court packing idea being floated by Roosevelt, they never ruled another New Deal program unconstitutional after that. Part of it was maybe they got a little bit of a message. Also, there were some openings that came up, and Roosevelt was able to fill them with people that would have agreed with him, their ideology, and so that also changed the balance of the court as well. All right, 3 courts we have to talk about. The Warren Court, 1953 to 1969. Chief Justice Earl Warren was appointed by Eisenhower, so it's called the Warren Court. You know, we talked about the Marshall Court, so we got the Warren Court here. Supreme Court, very active. This was a very judicially active court, so judicial activism. Give you an idea, Brown versus Board, overturning Plessy. Overturning precedent is, like I said before, overturning precedent is activism, if you want to look at it that way. The expanded defendants' rights. One of these cases we'll have is one of our 15, Gideon versus Wainwright in 63. That's right to counsel. We will talk about Miranda, even though it's not on our list. Self-incrimination. Apportionment of legislative districts. We did that with Baker versus Carr. That's what that was about. Prohibition of school organized prayer in the schools. That's one of our cases, Engel versus Vitale. It is, and so the last point about the Warren Court, you have to understand, is the most liberal court of the modern era. So that's post-World War II. Most liberal court of the modern era, Warren Court. Next comes the Burger Court. Chief Justice dies, and Warren Burger is appointed by Nixon to be the new Chief Justice. So he's Chief Justice from 69 to 86. More conservative than Warren, as you might imagine, because the Chief Justice was appointed by Nixon. Nixon got to fill a few spots, but it will be more liberal than one might have imagined. Narrowed, but did not overturn some defendants' rights cases, but very surprisingly liberal in some cases. 2 examples one example, Roe versus Wade in 1973, a very judicially active decision, and it was a surprise that the court ended up ruling that way, that a burger court would end up ruling that way. They did uphold school busing in some cases, which is extremely controversial in the 1970s. They did uphold affirmative action in some cases, in many cases. We'll talk about that in civil liberties and civil rights. And of course, the U.S. versus Nixon case in 74 that required President Nixon to turn his tapes over to the court. That was done by the Burger Court, which had several people that Nixon, I think had 4 appointees on that court, including the Chief Justice, and it still ruled against it. So surprisingly liberal in some cases. Then we get to the Rehnquist Court, which is the second most recent one. So 86 to 2005, he was appointed by President Reagan. Reversed or limited many liberal decisions by past courts. It is a definitely conservative court, especially limiting Congress' use of the commerce power to justify their overreach. And we had those cases, right? We had Lopez and we had Morrison. We talked about Lopez is our big case that said Congress went too far in using their commerce power. And so also it actually expanded and actually resurrected the idea of the court of federalism, limited national government power over the states. It resurrected the 10th Amendment. The states had been over time just saying that 10th Amendment doesn't really matter anymore. We're going to go for the federal government doing everything. Well, the states started to claw that back a little bit with the help of the Rehnquist court. All right, affirmative action laws have been eliminated. Some cases have been removed altogether. Again, we'll talk about that as the progress of affirmative action starting when we talk about civil rights. Okay, so the Rehnquist court is certainly a conservative court. Just remember that. And of course, Bush versus Gore also in the year 2000. All right, so the last slide. A couple of rhetorical questions, and then we'll get to some things. Okay, so how does the judicial branch fit into a supposedly democratic society? So here's the idea. It is decidedly not democratic. It's not supposed to be. It never was. It should not be. It's not elected or anything. So how should it be, or should it be subject to the whims of the electorate? Ideas here. What is the role then of the Supreme Court, and what did the framers want? And we know what the framers wanted. The best case we have is 78, Federal 78, talking about the judicial branch being the weakest branch, being the one that is the least chance to injure liberties and things like that. So let's look. So here's the idea, right? Over time, the court generally falls into line with public opinion. It does, but it doesn't work at the whims, the ups and downs, okay? That's the whims. Generally, over time, it will get there with slavery. So we've got some slavery issues. With discrimination, it gets there. It goes from Plessy to Brown, okay? Economic interference and then not economic interference. One of the things that happened recently, that happened very quickly, actually quickly for the Supreme Court, where it sort of falls into line, is the issue of gay marriage. The Supreme Court went very quickly when that decision was made. The public had already gone 60% or more in favor of saying gay marriage should be allowed, and the Supreme Court actually caught up with that very quickly in relation to the way they usually do things. But that's another example of the Supreme Court sort of catching up with public opinion over time. So remember, it's over time that happens. It's still upcoming. What do we have to deal with? There's going to be more in Obamacare. There's going to be ACA. There's going to be a case, heard in the next couple of weeks. It's like the second week of November or something like that. There'll be more gun control stuff. There'll be affirmative action. There'll be immigration. And there'll be a lot of things coming up that we haven't even thought of yet. So this ends the judiciary portion. Those rhetorical questions are really important because they are not an elected branch. Remember that. So hopefully you have all of this ready. Quiz coming up and then the test. So good luck on all that.